The organizer of the series, Dr. Nathan Ty, at the University of Nebraska at Kearney, and I want to again extend our continued thanks for the Kearney Public Library allowing us to have this venue and have these conversations. Really a cultural treasure here in the community, and also appropriate for this lecture as a member of the Frank family was one of the first city librarians, P.B. Frank, at the turn of the century. I also want to thank the G.W. Frank Museum, which is, as our director can attest, I have been bugging her quite frequently about all of the things that are in our presentation today, and this is really one of the incredible stories that we tell at the house and have information about at the house. So if you haven't been to the G.W. Frank Museum, I highly recommend coming and visiting us and seeing what we have over on the west side of campus. As always, we have a full bevy of talks coming up. In November, we're going to have Dr. Lena Hamburger-Cordia from the Buffalo County Historical Society, as well as from the UNK History Department, who's going to be talking about Ned Dunlap. And there are posters at the back. A great many of you will, if not by name, will remember by image the hand-carved ships that used to be on display here at the public library for generations above the children's section. And so Dr. Hamburger, or Dr. Cordia, has been piecing together the history of those items and kind of the really wild life of Ned Dunlap before he made those. And then in December, we're going to have John Flipworth, who's a graduating graduate student in our department, who's going to be talking about his research into the Civil War monument here downtown, which, again, generations of us will remember. It's been in multiple places over the years, whether it was in the middle of 25th Street for the older folks at the crowd, or for the younger folks, it was in the Mona parking lot, and now just within eyesight over on the other side of the railroad. And then in February, Dr. Will Stoudemire is going to be presenting some of his research on the history of the National Park Service, and specifically the Wapaki Navajo Nation and their relationship with national parks. As always, if you want more information on what we're doing at the History Department, please see our website and all of our requisite social media, where we're sharing the work that we're doing, as well as, more importantly, the work that our students are doing. Just incredible things that our students really do. If you would like to support the History Department, this QR code will take you to the foundation website, and you can support our students and their work there. It's also in the back if you're feeling particularly generous. Now, to today's presentation. Our speaker today is a graduate of Central Elementary. It's where he learned everything he ever really needed to know, and is a lifelong Kearney resident. It is me. So we are going to talk today about a story that might be familiar to some, but a story that is, I think, one of the thousands of tales that we tell at the Frank Museum about every resident, every patient, every nurse, every doctor, as well as the Frank family itself. This is a story of national and international importance. And it is a story that we have recorded in the house. There are little glints and glimmers of this story in our archive and in the holdings that we have. And it's a story that the Frank family also retains within their memory, and have provided things to the house over the years to help us tell this story. And that's the story of the Frank family during the Civil War. Now, again, I implore you all, if you have not visited the G.W. Frank Museum, really one of the cultural gems of the community, and this is where this story will end, but this is not where the story that I'm going to share with you today begins. And the story today begins on January 31st, 1865, when the Congress of the United States, the 38th Congress, passed the 13th Amendment. Now, for those who might not remember their high school civics or their college history classes, this is the 13th Amendment. That is the full text of the 13th Amendment. It's a very short, very sweet, very important amendment. That Section 1, neither slavery nor involuntary solitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, so shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Section 2, Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. With the passage of this amendment and the ratification by the requisite number of states, slavery was abolished in the United States. For those of you who've seen the Steven Spielberg film, this story is kind of captured in that story. Now, the passage was by no means assured. There was fraught debate whether it would be able to make it through the House, whether it would be able to find the requisite votes needed in Congress. And it was the culmination of decades of activism by African Americans, by abolitionists, by politicians, reformers, and activists from across the political spectrum in antebellum United States. And further pressure from untold numbers of enslaved men, women, and children who were fleeing to Union camps, to contraband camps, the refugee camps that surrounded the Union lines as the United States Army marched south. Meant that, you know, the victory over slavery was a long time coming and a long-held fight, and it ended in Congress. And as the reporters at the time tell us in newspaper reports of the passage of this amendment, to two Republicans in particular does our nation owe a debt of gratitude: to James M. Ashley, Toledo, Ohio, and Augustus Frank of Warsaw, New York. They held the laboring oars. For those who might not be familiar with the Franks and have not been to the house, this is the Frank family. George Washington Frank in the corner is one of the founders of the city of Kearney. His investment, his real estate, and his business acumen, which would bring a lot of Eastern capital and investment and interest into Kearney. We were going to be the next Minneapolis. Because the Kearney Gate, that we had a very long stride, that we were marching into the future. He brought, for those who were at our talk last month, brought electricity to the city of Kearney, brought irrigation to the city of Kearney, brought the cotton mill to the city of Kearney, brought a bicycle factory, a pickle factory, brickworks, stoneworks, the streetcar line. But his wider family, his parents, Dr. Augustus Frank at upper left, and then his mother, Jane Patterson Frank, were wealthy and notable figures in Warsaw, New York, which I'll introduce you to Warsaw in a bit. And Augustus Frank was a doctor, a medical doctor, as well as a businessman, and Jane Patterson Frank was a member of the Patterson family, which was a very deeply connected and influential political family in the state of New York. She had two brothers who served in Congress, one of whom was also the lieutenant governor of New York. And so the Franks really grew up in a very, very influential and aspirational family. And then George Frank's older brother, Augustus, who is the congressman who held the laboring oars. The stewardship of the 13th Amendment by Augustus Frank, here at lower left, is a little-known story due to the fact that he was the whip for the votes for the 13th Amendment. This is something that they are very intentionally not recording. This is conversations in cloakrooms. This is twisting elbows. This is, meeting off the Capitol and trying to convince congressmen to vote for this bill. And so, understandably, a lot of it is not documented, which is infuriating for a historian and understandable for the political operatives in the 1860s. Yet it's only a part of the Frank family story, and I'm going to actually walk you through a couple of Frank family Civil War stories today. We're going to talk about their abolitionist politics and their involvement in the abolition movement. We're going to talk about what George is doing during the Civil War before he shows up in Kearney. And then I'm going to also introduce you to their cousin William, who is one of the founders of Kearney and also has his own Civil War story to tell. But first I want to begin in their home, which is Warsaw, New York. So Warsaw is right here, just southeast of Buffalo in northwest New York. And the part of New York, and in the time period that they are living in, it's known as the burned over district. Now, for scholars of kind of antebellum America, this is a place that is very, very important. This is a part of the country, it's called the burned over district because of the frequency of forest fires, as well as the flames of reform and religious fervor that move through the area. This is the part of the country that leads to the emergence of the Millerite religious movement, now the Seventh-day Adventists, as well as the Latter-day Saints. It's also a stronghold of abolition, as well as temperance. And so there's a lot of political reform, religious reform, and activism that is kind of coming out of this part of the country in this time period. And this is very much something that the Franks are participants in. They are active members of their Presbyterian denomination. They're also very, very active temperance organizers and very, very active abolitionists. Dr. Frank is originally from Connecticut, but then settles in Warsaw and opens up both medical practice, but then a series of mercantile businesses that his sons will later take over. And that capital over generations will lead to the development of the businesses that put Kearney on the map in the 1880s and the 1890s. And they are incredibly successful, incredibly wealthy, and incredibly influential in their community. And so this is the Frank House in Warsaw. This is the family home. It is still there, smack dab in the center of town. There's a roundabout with a Civil War monument in the middle. It's across the street from the public library, the county courthouse, and their Methodist parish. It's a beautiful home that George and Augustus would call home and spend a great amount of time in. Still a beautiful home now. It's private businesses, but really demonstrating their wealth and their resources. Dr. Frank is very committed to a lot of different reform movements during his lifetime, and makes this known and unknown. The other thing that is infuriating for a historian is a lot of what he's involved in very intentionally did not keep records, as we're going to see. Dr. Frank was an abolitionist, and not just any type of abolitionist. Dr. Frank was an immediate abolitionist, which was on the far radical end of the spectrum. Abolitionist politics prior to the Civil War varied between advocates of gradual abolition, that parents would remain enslaved, but children would be freed after a set amount of time. There are advocates of immigration, of shipping enslaved men, women, and children, freeing them and sending them to Africa. There are other folks who see setting a time limit, that after a certain amount of time, a certain amount of population would be freed. Or there are folks who are advocating for payments to enslavers to free the men, women, and children that they hold in bondage. But Augustus Frank is immediate, that it needs to happen now, right now. Overnight, signing of a law or what have you, needs to happen now. And he makes that very, very clear. This is from the Liberator, which is one of the leading abolitionist newspapers of the antebellum period, where Augustus Frank is the first one listed on the Friends of the Immediate Emancipation of the state of New York. And so he is very, very clear in his politics. He funds and supports a number of abolitionist efforts, as we know. An anti-slavery society was formed in Warsaw in 1833. And according to the town history, which was written by one of these abolitionists, a friend of Dr. Frank's, in few parts of the country did the anti-slavery settlements start earlier or more strongly prevail than in this town. On October 3rd, 1835, at the invitation of William Lloyd Garrison, who's the editor of this newspaper, an anti-slavery convention was held. And Dr. Frank very, very proudly put his name on this, as did William Patterson, his brother-in-law, who was later a congressman for the Whig Party shortly thereafter. This led to a meeting in Utica where Patterson and Frank both attended. Frank was one of the delegates representing the Warsaw Anti-Slavery Party. The meeting was controversial from the start, and so the mayor of Utica called a town meeting to oppose the abolitionists meeting at the local parish. He called upon a local group of businessmen, politicians, and journalists to form a group opposing abolition. The mob of these anti-abolitionists stormed the meeting house where they were meeting, but the abolitionists outnumbered them 4-1. They tried to shout down the abolitionists and disrupt the meeting, but the abolitionists calmly called an end to the meeting and left, although unfortunately for the historical record, the anti-abolitionist forces stole the abolitionists' meeting minutes. So we don't actually know what George Frank, or what Dr. Frank said, because the records were stolen, and this is going to be a common theme across this, is we just can't know. The following year in Batavia, The Genesee County Anti-Slavery Society, of which Dr. Frank also attended, was similarly disrupted by a mob of anti-abolitionists. The mob labeled the abolitionists fanatics who threatened the stability of the nation. When the group reconvened in Warsaw the following week, Dr. Frank pledged significant funds to personally fund an abolitionist newspaper in Warsaw. This then became the American Citizen, which is a hard to come by abolitionist newspaper that moved around Western New York in the 1840s, kind of in search of funding and things. On November 13th, 1839, in a meeting of the Western New York Anti-Slavery Society held in Warsaw, the society forwarded the creation of a political party dedicated to the cause of abolition. And this became what is known as the Liberty Party, which is the first political party dedicated to the abolition of slavery. Founded in Warsaw, New York, more likely than not, although the records don't provide a lot of information, with the involvement of Augustus Frank. And appropriately, one of the experts on the Liberty Party is a former member of our department, so I want to quote from Vern Volpe in his study of the Liberty Party. By casting a Liberty ballot, concerned Christians separated themselves from the sins they thought infected much of antebellum America. And so this was a moral position, an ethical position, an advocacy for human rights that imbued this early and ultimately unsuccessful political party, but brought together a lot of the abolitionist forces in Western New York and across the country, kind of seeing the idea that abolition and reform of the end of enslavement could come through the political process, which we're going to see leading to the creation of the Republican Party. The Franks also, and this is again difficult, are recorded in an oral history that is taken in the 1890s as being conductors on the Underground Railroad. Now, the Underground Railroad as the kind of hidden paths north that we can understand. This is a map of Underground Railroad routes in Western New York, and Warsaw is right here. Very, very close to the border. You can get folks right over at Buffalo. Now, part of the challenge of this is a subversive organization. This is a legal organization, so they're not keeping good records by design. Which leaves us with this oral history that just lists Augustus Frank as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. He is understandably not keeping records of what he is doing. His family is not keeping records of what he is doing. And so it is really difficult to ascertain the veracity of whether there was an Underground Railroad station or whether he was supplying or supporting. But we can infer based on his politics and what we know about him, more likely than not he was. Or at the very least, knew of his neighbors and friends who were also supporting the flight of men, women, and children to freedom. We know that his neighbors and the members of his community really supported his reform efforts, as his obituary tells us. In all the reforms of the day, temperance, abolition, and others, which were calculated to benefit his fellow man, he was actively engaged. And that's all his obituary tells us about his politics. Unfortunately, again, for the historians who are trying to piece this together. But when Dr. Augustus Frank passed away in 1851, he had set the stage for his sons to really kind of continue this work. Augustus Frank gets involved in politics very, very early. He becomes the county chair for the Whig Party before he can vote. Mind you, the voting age is 21 in this time period, so he's a teenager when he is running the local political party. He would eventually be elected to Congress in 1858, 1860, and 1862, and then choosing not to run for re-election in 1860. He is very early on, has a lot of opportunities to participate in different political events. He stumps for Zachary Taylor in 1848. And then this is a letter to William Henry Seward, who is the governor of New York and kind of the leading political figure of the day, who will eventually become Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State and will very famously buy Alaska for the United States. But this is a letter from Augustus Frank to William Seward. He is with the kind of rise of the nascent Republican Party in the 1850s, he's going to very quickly leave the Whigs and join the Republican Party. So much so that Augustus Frank is a delegate to the first Republican National Convention in 1856, which will nominate John C. Fremont as the first Republican political party candidate. He will then run on the Republican Party platform in 1858, and then more importantly for what we're going to talk about today, he will run in 1860. Now, a little bit of a quiz. Who is the Republican nominee in 1860? Abraham Lincoln, yeah. And so initially a supporter of William Seward as a good New Yorker, he is endorsing a candidate from New York. Seward is also running for the presidency but loses to Abraham Lincoln at the Republican National Convention, and Lincoln extends the Secretary of State to him and brings him into his cabinet. But we have a lot of material about the campaign in 1860 and 1862 and his support for Abraham Lincoln, including the endorsement of the local Wide Awakes, which were the youth organization for the Republican Party in the 1860 election. This is a Wide Awake here. Wide Awakes wore rubber rain slickers and very distinctive caps and marched around with torches at night, having rallies for Abraham Lincoln. And we have an account of one of these where the Wisco brass band, the Hume Wide Awakes, aided in swelling the number, Mr. Frank addressing the large crowd for an hour or more. And the speech was well received. In fact, Mr. F., his talents for public speaking, of which he himself might hitherto have been unconscious, but which the people everywhere are glad to recognize and engage. The numerous calls for his services have been responded to at great personal sacrifices and with an alacrity and zeal worth of all condemnation. He also supports the Wide Awakes himself. We also do have a little bit of newspaper evidence that he buys oil for their lamps. He buys like a gallon of whale oil so that they can march around and advocate for the candidacy of Abraham Lincoln. And so he serves from 1858 until the end of his 1864 term, and is part of the radical Republican wing of the party. This is the part of the Republican Party in this time period that is advocating for immediate abolition, is advocating for black suffrage, for the extension of full constitutional rights to African Americans, and is part of the party that very carefully Abraham Lincoln has to kind of navigate with more moderate Republican forces. But he is an ally of Seward. He knows Salmon P. Chase. He knows all of kind of the leading political figures of the day. Unfortunately, their correspondence doesn't survive because a lot of their conversations are probably happening off the record. This is a photo by Matthew Brady, who is kind of the leading photographer of Washington, D.C. You've almost certainly seen Brady photos of Abraham Lincoln and all the other leading figures kind of the day. Here we see also at right, this is a ballot printed in a newspaper. It's the endorsement for the Republican Party platform in Wyoming County. In this time period, political parties would print off the ballots, and you would pick up a ballot from a party boss kind of standing outside the election at the voting booth, and you would take that and then you would just drop it into the ballot box. Or you can cut it out of the newspaper because it looks the same. And we can see Gus Frank at the very, very, very bottom. And he has some important roles. He's the chairman of the Committee on the Library of Congress. He is the chairman, most importantly, though, of the New York congressional delegation, which we will see. And there's a lot of photos. We actually have more photos than we have letters of Augustus Frank in the 1860s in Congress, which is great for visual purposes, but terrible if you're trying to figure out what is going on. We also don't have that many speeches. He's a little reticent to talk sometimes, but we do have a very important address that he gives in 1860. So after Abraham Lincoln is nominated at the Republican National Convention in Chicago, and news makes its way to Washington, D.C., the announcement has also come that Hannibal Hamlin of Maine has been nominated as the vice president. And Augustus Frank has the privilege of kind of leading the public announcement of that in Washington, D.C. And so this is the published address of the meeting of the Republicans in Washington, D.C., where they ratify what has happened at the Republican National Convention, and then they march to Hamlin's residence and kind of proclaim him as the vice presidential nominee. And he kind of lays out his initial support for William Seward, but why he is going to ultimately support Honest Abe. I am with the utmost confidence say that New York will not be found wanting. She will discharge her whole duty, and the 35 electoral votes of the Empire State will be given for honest old Abe Lincoln of Illinois. Our party is young, vigorous, and prepared to administer the government, while the Democratic Party totters upon the brink of disillusion and slavery propagandism. Slavery has demanded that within the slave states, the constitutional rights of inhabitants of free states should be ignored. The most shameful outrages have been perpetrated against the rights for personal freedoms of northern citizens traveling to slave states or residing there, that too many times, with the full sanction, approval of the public authorities, free speech has been denied, insult has been heaped upon them, and at times the most brutal treatment. They have been compelled to submit at almost every indignity, imprisonment, tar and feathers, punishment by stripes, and in many cases they have been driven from the slave states. Not only have northern citizens suffered such indignities, but whole communities, men respected for their obedience to the law, their quiet and inoffensive lives, and their industry have been with their families, been exiled from their homes because they do not consider slavery a blessing and were unwilling to give up their long-cherished convictions. The threats of disillusion of this union, so often made of late, all come from the same party. Sometimes it grieves me to hear them, as it does every lover of this country. At other times, I move to laughter. So puerile and contemptible they seem to be. Poor, impotent men without the power to make even a blade of grass grow, threatening to rend asunder this union cemented by the blood of Christians and patriots and watched over by an all-wise being, who alone can set up and destroy kingdoms and nations. I'm glad to say that such threats have proved unavailing. They are exacting in their demands for the protection and preservation of slavery, even to the giving up on our part of all independence, including freedom of speech, thought, and action. Now, after he concluded this address, Augustus Frank joined a crowd of well-wishers and the U.S. Marine Band. The procession wound its way through the streets of D.C. to Hamlin's house, actually a boarding house, where Hamlin then steps out on the balcony and accepts the nomination of the vice presidency on the ticket with Abraham Lincoln. So really kind of a fascinating moment in the development of Abraham Lincoln's candidacy. And he does get to know Lincoln quite well. We have a not insignificant amount of material relating to Augustus's friendship with Abraham Lincoln. And he writes this letter to his uncle, George Patterson. I am pleased with the president. He seems anxious to do his duty, and I think it is perfectly honest. He has a great responsibility in the needs and the good wishes and aid of all loyal men. Little is said about our last act, abolishing slavery here. This is the act to abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. But in communion with the Emancipation message of the president, it has been overshadowed by the Emancipation Proclamation, as you can imagine. He also then, as the war begins, as combat begins between the United States and the Confederacy, he is critically positioned in Washington, D.C. As a member of the New York congressional delegation. He is both supporting families who are looking for loved ones, relaying messages from the wounded in the hospitals in Washington, D.C., and actually going to the battlefield to relay information to his constituents. He tells in a letter to the Western New Yorker, which is one of the newspapers published in their area, "It is a sad day here. I trust I may never see the like again." And this is a letter that he writes after going to Bull Run, 30 miles southwest of Washington, D.C., the first major engagement of the Civil War. After the conclusion of hostilities, he very quickly makes his way down there and works his way through the hospitals, meeting with young men from Western New York, writing letters back to their family, talking, relaying information that they want, and then providing information to the local paper. And he hopes that this is going to be the last. But as we all know, we've got 4 more years of sustained military conflict. And Augustus tells us a lot about that. He's visiting the hospitals as depicted here. In those hospitals, there are between 20 and 30,000 sick and wounded men. And the first question which they'll naturally ask is, where in all of the city affliction is my boy, my brother, and my husband? Many of the members, too, are diligent night and day, serving their constituent in this way, including the Honorable Augustus Frank. And so we have information that tells us he is visiting the hospitals, he is visiting the sick, he is visiting the wounded, he is writing back to parents concerned about what is going on. We have a lot of information about what the hospitals were like in Washington, D.C. in this time period, because there was a nurse who was working at one of these hospitals who wrote a lot of letters and a couple of poems about it by the name of Walt Whitman. But Gus is also moving through the crowds and talking and doing the work that he needs to do as a elected official from Western New York. Now, among those who are wounded, among those who are serving is his cousin, William. Now, William, I want to deviate a little bit here. William is an interesting figure, as we'll see. William is rightfully one of founders of the city of Kearney. He's buried in the Kearney Cemetery. He's recognized in early histories as being one of the founders of the city of Kearney. He's the son of William Patterson, so he's a nephew of Dr. Augustus Frank and Jane Patterson. His father, William Patterson, is a congressman for the Whig Party but dies in 1838 while in office. And then his wife, William's mother, dies just 2 weeks later. And so he's an orphan. And he moves through the Frank and Patterson families as they kind of pass him along. He lived first with the Lieutenant Governor, George Washington Patterson, his uncle, who then eventually tires of the boy and then sends him to the Franks in Warsaw. And we do have a surprisingly robust amount of material about his childhood. The teenage William was too much to handle. And the Franks eventually sent him further on down the family line, but what we have recorded in family letters is that he was killing small animals. Yeah, he was involved in dogfighting and killing cats. And so they grew tired of this and sent him along to others. But when he's with the Franks, he actually works as a clerk in their dry goods store that they run in Warsaw. And he moves to Minnesota in the 1850s, kind of to get a fresh start, move further west, and then does serve in the Civil War. And what this document here is the commission that he receives from Abraham Lincoln. This is a notarized duplicate copy of that. You can see there's Abraham Lincoln's signatures here. It's not really his signature, a secretary has copied it out. And this is included in his request for a homestead in Buffalo County, kind of demonstrating his service during the Civil War and why he shouldn't have to prove up for the 5-year period because he is using his military service to count for that. And he does ultimately serve throughout much of the Eastern Theater. He serves at the Battle of Gettysburg, which he writes in a letter to his uncle about and writes to others, kind of talking about what the conditions were. He tells his uncle that we might have been marching and fighting night and day since we left Frederick, Maryland. We were just in time on the morning of the 2nd to save our army and turn defeat into victory. So is involved in major events and eventually becomes a member of the Grand Army of the Republic here in Kearney, Sedgwick Lodge number 1, and gets a job for the Burlington, Missouri Railroad after the war as a land agent and a locator. And so he comes out here as they're beginning to develop the rail line that they're going to link with the Union Pacific at Kearney Junction. That's why it's Junction, because they're bringing the railroads together. He homesteads in the area, and then he convinces his cousin George to move to Kearney. He says that it is a bustling community, that there's a lot of possibility and potential for Kearney, and so you should come out here. And so that's what ultimately then brings the Franks out here, is that their ne'er-do-well cousin who has kind of reformed himself through work and military service and some business success is able to lure them out here. And so this is a photo of William from an early history of Buffalo County. And so that brings us to George. George is the focus, and his wife are the focus of the G.W. Frank Museum. This is a Civil War era photo of the family. Gus is at the far right, and then George is at left standing. He is in partnership with his brother. They run a mercantile business where, based on newspaper reports from the 1850s and 1860s, they sell just about anything they can get their hands on. I'm going to show you a couple. They're selling furs and carpet and wallpaper and clothes and iron and tools and just about a little bit of everything. He does not ultimately serve in the war. He has a family, he has children who were born during the war, Gus Jr., as well as George William. So 2 young children, a family, and ultimately does not serve, but does financially support local efforts in Wyoming County, funding different efforts to support soldiers. He contributes $50 to a small fund that will help families of men who are serving in combat. And after the war in 1869, he moves to Corning, Iowa, which is in Adams County, Iowa, kind of south central Iowa. And he's going to stay there for a little while until his cousin lures him out to Kearney, where he will remain until, spoilers for you who haven't been to the Frank Museum, he loses all his money in the Depression of 1893 and has to flee town with the rest of the family, but leaves a really nice house for us all to enjoy. And the Franks, again, they're selling everything. This is Augustus and George Washington Frank's dress goods, wallpaper, carpets, cotton goods, furs, just about everything in the kind of western New York area can be bought or purchased at the Frank dry goods store. Now, we don't have a lot on George's politics. We don't know whether he agreed with the abolitionism of his father and his brother. We know, we can presume he voted Republican and voted for his brother, but we have an artifact at the museum. And it's a subtle artifact, and it is on display, but if you go, ask to have it pointed out. And that is George Washington Frank's copy of the biography of John Brown. And for those who might not remember their Civil War history, John Brown is the radical abolitionist who leads the raid on Harper's Ferry, one of the kind of, who's also from upstate New York. Whether he knew the Franks is unknown, possible, but unknown. This is the first copy of the biography of John Brown that is published after he is hung. And it does have George Washington Frank, Warsaw, New York, inscribed in the front. So presumably he read it, keeping abreast of current events, whether it was because he was an abolitionist like his father and brother, we can only speculate, but this does kind of support that claim. But coming back to Gus, coming back to Warsaw, we do know this is a statement that Mr. Frank, here at the top, read to the community in Wyoming County, listing all of the men, the amount of men that needed to meet the draft quota in 1863. So a draft is imposed, and conscription is imposed to boost numbers and kind of renew the United States Armed Forces. And based on the population and number of men need to be drafted, and although George and Augustus do not serve during the Civil War, they both do register for the draft. And so here's George, 31. He's listed as mechanic. And then Frank Augustus is listed as a merchant. So why George Washington Frank is listed as a mechanic, unclear. It means a lot of things back then. And then we don't know whether he wasn't drafted. You also had the option to pay a fee to have someone else serve for you, or contribute money to other. There were options to still support the war effort if you were drafted but not actually serve. And so whether he did that, he would have had the financial resources to do. It is unknown. But we do, again, both know that they do register. We also know in this time period that in DC, Augustus is spending a lot of time with Abraham Lincoln. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of correspondence between the two men. There are some things in the Abraham Lincoln papers relating to Gus, but we do have secondhand accounts of their relationship. This is a statement that was shared by F.B. Carpenter, who is a painter who paints a portrait of Abraham Lincoln and spends some time living in the White House in the middle of the Civil War. And so for scholars, it's a really great fly-on-the-wall kind of account of what's going on in the White House from kind of an unobtrusive observer who's just there to paint the picture. And he tells us that Gus is having conversations with Abraham Lincoln regarding Salmon P. Chase, his controversial Secretary of Treasury, who Abraham Lincoln ultimately accepts his resignation and then nominates him to be the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. And so Gus is having a conversation about Chase. Again, Chase is a very controversial figure within the Lincoln administration. He really wants higher office and is kind of making moves that he can run for the presidency after Abraham Lincoln. And he offers his resignation a lot. And Abe ultimately kind of calls his bluff and accepts it. And a lot of people have a lot of things to say about Salmon P. Chase. And Gus replies that Salmon P. Chase is actually, a really good politician. His services to the country, his patriotism are really great. And Abraham Lincoln starts crying to Augustus. The tears instantly sprang to Mr. Lincoln's eyes. Yes, he said, that is true. We have stood together in the time of trial, and I should despise myself if allowed personal differences to affect my judgment and his fitness for the office of Chief Justice. So Augustus is kind of one of the people that Abraham Lincoln is having this conversation, kind of feeling out whether Salmon P. Chase should become the Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, which he ultimately does. We also know, more importantly though, to bring us to the story that I opened with, is Augustus is really critical for the passage of the 13th Amendment. As leader of the delegation, the Republican delegation for New York, one of the largest states in the United States at the time, major political power, and really divided political class, with former Democrats, more moderate Republicans, radical Republicans, everybody. And Gus has to get enough votes out of them that the 13th Amendment will be successful. And we have a fairly detailed, actually, account of how this worked from one of the clerks who worked with Gus and Congressman Ashley. As the clerk tells us, a systematic canvass in his favor was inaugurated, seeing it was that enough of votes were assured to pass the amendment. When again called up for action, was under the immediate charge of Honorable James S. Ashley of Toledo, Ohio, and the Honorable Augustus Frank of Warsaw, New York. They planned and executed the campaign, keeping their own counsel as to the progress made. Again, that's why we don't have any record of it, because they're only talking to each other. Never mentioning how this or that representative would vote, but summoning to their assistance such members of both sides of the House politically as they deemed best. It was a quest and an effective canvass. So Ashley and Frank initially start working through the House of Representatives, figuring out how people are going to vote. And they're not telling anybody how everybody else is going to vote. They're only telling each other. They're not writing it down. Again, infuriating for the historian, great for the politician. When ascertained that a member who had voted against the amendment at the previous session was certainly to vote for it on the next roll call, either Mr. Ashley or Mr. Frank would come to the desk where this clerk sat, state the fact to Mr. Shearman or myself, and when Mr. Shearman would unlock the drawer, take out the precious tally sheet and place a yeah checkmark against the name. Quietly, this work went on for several weeks. Probably Mr. Ashley, Mr. Frank, Mr. Shearman, and myself were the only persons who ever saw the tally sheet. Now, not one in the secret got hold of it would have meant, what it would have meant would have been unknown. So they're keeping the secret record of how people are going to vote. They're cajoling who they need to cajole. They're twisting arms on who they need to twist arms on so that they can get the 13th Amendment passed. Now, they say that no one can see that tally sheet. Now, this is a tally sheet of the 13th Amendment. More likely than not, this is actually the tally sheet from the day that it was voted upon. This is at the New York Public Library. But it is the tally sheet from the Speaker of the House, Shiloh Colfax. And we see Augustus Frank vote on the 27th. So this is from the day that they voted. This isn't the tally sheet that they had secretly kept away in a drawer. But they did then vote. And so I showed this at the very beginning, but this is the 13th Amendment as signed by the House of Representatives, with Augustus Frank smack dab in the middle. This is at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And so the press rightfully said, two Republicans in particular, does the nation owe a debt of gratitude to James M. Ashley of Toledo, Ohio, and Augustus Frank of Warsaw, New York. They helped the labor in oars. And this is from Horace Greeley's New York Tribune. And so for that, we also get a sense that this effort was rewarded by the Lincoln administration. Again, we don't have direct evidence, we don't have letters, we don't have other things, but when Abraham Lincoln then has his second inaugural ball, one of the hosts is Augustus Frank, which is held at the Patent Office, which is now the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. So we get some sense that he is likely be receiving some accolade and some benefit for the work that he did. That there is recognition that is coming from the Lincoln administration for what he is doing. So this is the hosts of, and it will also be the receiving line for everyone who comes to the inaugural ball. But as we know, Abraham Lincoln doesn't get to have much of a second term. And with his assassination, which by this point, when Lincoln is assassinated, Augustus Frank has chosen not to run for re-election in 1864 and has returned home to Warsaw. And then the news reaches them in April of 1865 that Abraham Lincoln has been assassinated. And very, very quickly, the people of Warsaw want to commemorate and honor and mourn the president. The city, we know the city closed all its businesses, all the bells tolled, and everyone was called to the Methodist Church, which is across the street from their house, to mourn what business organizers deemed, quote, the terrible and heart-rending calamity that beset this nation. In this honor, a final triumph of our arms on that battlefield. Now, across Warsaw, homes were draped in black, people donned mourning clothing, and lowered flags to half-mast. And after the town settled into the pews at the Methodist Church, they asked Augustus Frank to go and speak, as the member of the community who knew Abraham Lincoln best. Frank shared his insights and memories of the figure who he shared, quote, the warmth of a personal friend, who had enjoyed unusual facilities for knowing the great work performed by the president, as well as his spotless character as a man and a statesman. Frank also described Lincoln's sublime faith, steadfast purpose, and pure integrity. And as someone known to Lincoln as an important political figure, he is then asked to accompany Abraham Lincoln's body. As it moves through western New York, he accompanies the body on the funeral train from Albany to Buffalo, where Abraham Lincoln lays in state on his journey back to Springfield. And this is the funeral as depicted in Buffalo, when he is, there's a parade from the train station to City Hall where he lies in state. After the war, he remains connected to politics. Gus is elected to the New York State Constitutional Convention in 1867 and 1894. So no longer a member of Congress, but still an active Republican political figure. He's also having other people from his time. He has the Speaker of the House come and speak in Warsaw. This is also in 1867. We also know from suffrage newspapers in 1894 that he's advocating for the inclusion of a suffrage amendment to the New York State Constitution in 1894. So we see that kind of reformist impulse that he carried, that his father had, continuing well into the late 19th century. In 1872, a local committee was formed with him as the vice president to build the Civil War monument that still remains in the middle of the traffic circle in Warsaw to this day. And those are Confederate cannons that were captured and put on display. And this is actually catty corner from their house. So the photographer who's taking this photo, the camera, is in the front lawn of the Frank House in Warsaw, New York. He negotiated, he purchased the marble at the Centennial Exhibition in 1876. But, you know, I want to return us to, why should we care? Why do we care what an obscure congressman from upstate New York did? Why should we care? You know, yeah, his brother has a fancy house. Yeah, his brother was involved in Kearney. Because Augustus cared about us. Augustus would make regular yearly visits to Kearney. And this is a letter to M.A. Brown, the founding editor of the Kearney Hub, both renewing his subscription, but then also talking about the public advocacy that the Hub does for local improvements, specifically on the building of the canal. And takes pains to commend the Hub for the gallant fight in enlarging the canal, and that this is a wise interest for its future growth and prosperity. And I could think for a moment of doing anything other than voting to enlarge the canal. I look upon the canal as key to the future prosperity of Kearney, giving the city as it would the greatest water power in the state of Nebraska. And we do, these are letters that we have at the house, kind of documenting Gus's relationship with the city of Kearney. So he's a proud hub subscriber and proud advocate for local improvements to the community. And when he passes away, just a year after this, an obituary runs in the hub, talking about the benefit and the friendship that Augustus Frank had for the city of Kearney. Owing to the large interest of the deceased in the city and his positions as a financial backer of the Frank Improvement Company, and as you would learn at the Frank Museum, a great many times, Augustus gets his brother out of a jam and finds somebody in the East with capital for improving the city of Kearney. This announcement is of peculiar interest to Kearney people, who's also well known personally to many of our people, as it been his custom to visit Kearney once a year. He was a man of superior business qualifications, was prominent in financial and political circles, and was held in the highest possible repute by many thousands of people throughout the country, as well as in his native state. Now, that could be the end of the story. 1895, Gus passes away. But he's a real estate magnate and has a lot of money. And so, this is a deed held at the University of Nebraska at Kearney of land owned by Augustus Frank, sold to the state of Nebraska by his widow, Agnes Frank. And upon this chunk of land, the University of Nebraska at Kearney would be built. Specifically, the administration building. Actually, it's like the northern half of the administration building. It's not the whole administration building, but it sounds more epic if it's the whole chunk of land. But so much of what we know as the city is rooted in this story. The financial gain that the Franks were able to do in Annabelle, New York, the political power that he was able to amass in the 1860s, his work with, he also works with railroads and other efforts, right, is able to bring this family out here. Their cousin brings them out, brings George out. Gus is the money man. And out of that, we got a pretty nice university, I do have to say. So with that, I will take questions, but thank you all.
It's a curious title, the laboring oars.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean they were giving birth, or what does that mean?
I think it's like in a classical sense, they're like in a ship, you know, like they're the ones who are stroking, like pushing the ship forward, kind of thing. Yeah, and it's repeated a lot. That particular line, the New York Tribune pens it, and then over the wire service, it ends up in most of the papers across the country. But it doesn't necessarily always explain why they were the laboring oars. It just kind of says they did it. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You said the cousin, William Patterson?
Yeah.
Was reformed. What do we know about him between the time he came here and the time he died? Any more dead animals?
No, it's a weird thing to survive. Of the kind of archival material that we have, the Patterson family is actually incredibly well documented. There's a biography of the Patterson family. They have letters at the University of Michigan. They have material at the University of Rochester, all over. And they're all kind of evasive of this. This is one of the letters that survives. If reports are correct, he is worse than a very bad boy. Doesn't really say what, mind you, because we don't necessarily always have the full set of correspondence. So, but I would imagine as a young kid, being an orphan, kind of being shuttled between families is really difficult in this time period. But he does straighten out. But beyond what is recorded in the family letters is killing small animals, which is unfortunate.
Where did he enlist in the Civil War? Did he enlist from Minnesota?
He did enlist in Minnesota, yeah.
I wonder what kind of officer he was if he didn't have much judgment.
Well, and based on the archival record, Abraham Lincoln does sign the commission, but Abraham Lincoln does ask Augustus Frank what he thinks about his cousin becoming an officer, and Augustus is a little circumspect and kind of a little like, yeah, he'd be fine. Like, So he does talk to his cousin, he does ask for his cousin to talk to Abraham Lincoln and Edward Stanton. It would require kind of looking at their unit and seeing if there's anything surviving from any of the other men, about whether they thought Patterson was a good officer or not. But he got a commission.
And he did become a serial killer.
He didn't become a serial killer, as far as we know. Mr. Anderson.
Is there a connection between the Warsaw GAR statue and the one that was here in Kearney?
That would be a good question for our speaker in December. But these statues, particularly the statues, are often mass produced. So this, I believe, is stone, like the one that we have here in town, but there are companies that kind of make it, you see the same kind of, figure, and a great many of them. So they could have been manufactured by the same company. It would probably require crawling around on that and trying to find a maker's mark. And as much as I want to get arrested in upstate New York, but I could probably ask their town historian to see. But yeah, it might be from the same company.